Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk about my ancestors, the Jameses, who lived in your beautiful area of Monmouthshire in the 19th century and a little into the 20th. My presentation is based on Between Heaven and Earth, A Journey with My Grandfather, which is my biography of Stanley James, 1869 to 1951. He lived what they call a rich and colourful life, and the second half of my talk will be devoted to his extraordinary adventures. Stanley as a boy came to your area for his summer holidays, but never actually lived there. But his father did, and so did a whole line of Jameses before him. The Jameses, all of whom were farming families, came from the tiny Pembrokeshire village of Nevern. This slide shows Nevern Church, where I found about 40 graves with the name James on them. In about 1720, one Daniel James moved to Llangibby and worked as a farm labourer. By 1775, this Daniel James was listed as an elder at the Congregational Chapel at New Inn, pictured here. Soon after that, he qualified as a minister, and the Reverend Daniel James, as he was by then, assumed overall responsibility for the chapel, apparently running the ministry for his farm at Bassaleg and travelling the 10 miles on horseback to take services. When I was researching the area for my book, I contacted the Reverend Gordon Cook, who is now minister at New Inn, and asked if I could attend the morning service. I was made to feel very welcome, and I sat in my pew, listening to his sermon. It was moving to think that an ancestor of mine had been the pastor there 240 years before. After the service, my partner Sue and I were invited for lunch by a couple in the congregation, an occasion we shall never forget. There was a second Daniel James, who in 1817 appeared at Cumbrook Farm. This is Stanley's grandfather and my great-great-grandfather. At the age of 65, the second Daniel married Mary Powell of Llangibby, and they had 3 children, Miriam, Lemuel, and Daniel. This is the third Daniel in the story, rather confusingly. And he was Stanley's father and my great-grandfather. And he also became a congregational minister. I knew Cumbrook Farm was set in a deep enclosed valley north of Caerleon, according to my grandfather's description in one of his books. He didn't waste the opportunity to wax lyrical about Caerleon's romantic associations with King Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere. I looked up the meaning of Cumbrook, and it translated as the hollow of the badger, and I instantly loved the name. The settle in the kitchen had apparently doubled up as a pulpit for itinerant preachers, the family by now being strong Congregationalists. My physical journey took me to what I reckon was the right area. There I encountered Llangdegpeth Reservoir, forgive my rather inept Welsh pronunciation. On the west side was a small area of trees, but beyond it, a vast expanse of water. I became suspicious. Was the elusive farmhouse one of a number of properties submerged beneath the reservoir when it was created in the early 1960s to supply water to Cardiff? I have to wait till the next day when I made the trip to Gwent Archives in Ebervale to find out. There, I was shown some maps that clinched it. There was Cumbrook, on a pre-1960s map, a farm perched above the banks of Sawbrook, its hedged fields rising up on the easterly side to a point above the shoreline of today's reservoir. I was also shown photographs. This one is of the valley in question, obviously before the reservoir, And the farm, Cumbrook Farm, is just out of the picture to the right, just beyond. You can see a car um, zigzagging up the hill, and the farm is just off picture there. A photograph that later came my way showed Cumbrook white facade in the distance, and in this picture you can see it on the far side. Obviously the dam is being constructed here, and you can see a largish white house on the other side of the valley. I saw others of the dam being constructed, pickup trucks, caterpillar bulldozers and earth removers, but disappointingly the scarred landscape was all that was left. I drove back to the reservoir, which the previous day had kept its secret from me. I parked up, this time realizing that my car was now occupying a space where the cows, sheep and chickens that my ancestors kept had once grazed and pecked. The staff in the visitor centre told me that when the water's low, you can see the site of the old well and the feeding troughs. And one more photo, colour one, obviously during construction of the dam, and the farm is on the right-hand side with its white facade on the side of the valley. The coming of the reservoir was a trauma for most of the residents. There were many objections submitted to the minister, and he held a public inquiry in October 1957, but Cardiff Corporation won the day. The cost of constructing the reservoir was estimated at £3 million. People affected were in line for compensation, but they had to fight for every penny. In my searching, I found out about a distant cousin, Hugh Greener from Pontyclean, who was descended from Lemuel James, my great-grandfather's brother and Stanley's uncle. Hugh told me that Lemuel had helped his mother, Mary, farm Cumbrook as tenants, and in the early 1860s, he married Worcestershire girl Martha Bradley. It was around this time that he was, quotes, an ardent follower of the hounds and the assistant overseer for Llangibby. And here he is, Lemuel. So far, so conventional. But over the next 2 hours, Hugh gave me a very different side to Stanley's uncle. Lemuel was a crook, he announced with a wide grin on his face. I've been back, really? I swigged my tea and waited. In 1876, at the age of 37, Lemuel was charged with forging 2 bills of exchange, one for £60 and another for 30, in the name of his wife's stepfather. He was also declared a bankrupt. Hugh had found reports of the case in no less than 5 local newspapers of the time: the Western Mail, the South Wales Daily News, the County Observer and Monmouthshire Central Advertiser, the Pontypool Free Press and Herald of the Hills, and the Monmouthshire Merlin. Wonderful names. Apparently, Lemuel had gone into the Usk branch of the London and Provincial Bank and presented the bills of exchange, which had been signed by Isaac Hobbes, his wife's stepfather. The bank, knowing who Lemuel was, cashed them, but Hobbes said the signatures were not his, adding that he knew James's affairs were in a bad state. £60 in 1876 was worth about 6,500 in 2020, so a considerable sum. Lemuel was summoned to appear at the next assizes and bailed in the sum of £220. He was sentenced to 12 months in Usk jail with hard labour. Hugh told me that this large involved breaking up rocks day after day. Enough of Lemuel and the James clan in Monmouthshire. It's time to turn to my grandfather. In 1869, his father Daniel was in Bristol with his new wife Clara, and they gave birth to Stanley in December. There they are. There are the 3 of them. Thereafter, Daniel continued the family's easterly trajectory, taking up positions in no less than 4 London churches, 3 of which he resigned from after clashes with the deacons. Nevertheless, Stanley's father was highly regarded as a pastor. The Congregational Yearbook said that he had one of the most wonderful voices ever given to man, its note being a rich baritone, full of undertones and harmonies. Well, a lot to live up to then for Stanley. There was no escape for him on Clara Palsford's side of the family either. Here too there was a gamut of ministers. What was a boy to do? Well, rebel, of course. At Whitgift School, Stanley skipped lunch and spent his pocket money on books by radical writers. He won a school prize for an essay on Keats and had his poems published in the school magazine. This slide shows writers who were a big influence on him. In the middle, there's W.T. Stead, the founder of investigative journalism, social reformer and medium, who attended Daniel's Church and was a friend of the Jameses. Then there was Walt Whitman, top right, the American poet of democracy and personal freedom, whom Stanley idolized. Likewise, bottom right, Ralph Waldo Emerson, also the American. After school, Stanley spent the next 6 years chucking up his course at Aberystwyth University, studying to become a congregational minister and giving that up, trying his hand at becoming an actor with disastrous results, and teaching at several dubious establishments. In his Richmond lodgings, he did, however, befriend the 75-year-old George Julian Harney, seen here bottom left, Chartism's enfant terrible, who was still writing articles for the radical Newcastle Chronicle. And on the stairs, he bumped into none other than the lofty figure of Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's fellow revolutionary communist, pictured top left. Stanley, now 23, was as restless as ever. He disliked suburbia and wasn't speaking to his father. So, when his brother, Norman, pictured here, decided to emigrate to Canada, Stanley joined him. They set sail from Liverpool on the SS Parisian, pictured here, and arrived in Halifax on the 2nd of April, 1893. It's worth noting Stanley's bleak feelings on leaving. He writes, "No convict on the point of being transported to Van Diemen's Land could have felt more hopeless of the future than I. Faith was dead. Ambition too had succumbed. It is scarcely possible to exaggerate the sense of desolation with which I set sail for the New World." They travelled west to Calgary and found work in the foothills of the Rockies. Stanley landed a job on the ranch of W. Stewart, a gruff Englishman who hated drifters from the old country. Apparently, Stanley took a while to master horsemanship, and Stewart took him off cowboy duties to teach his daughter her ABC. Eventually, Stanley did feel more at ease in the saddle and joined in the annual roundups and branding sessions. I myself spent 2 summers in Alberta following my grandfather's footsteps. 2 factors aided my investigations. The first was 2 1893 photos of cowboys. There was a fresh-faced youth among them who didn't look like the other gritty cowhands. Could that be Stanley, I wondered? And I'm referring in these 2 photos to the one on the right, the man in centre foreground sitting on a horse with his hands on his hips, and in the photo on the left, the figure on the far left helping his mates to brand some cattle. When I was in Alberta, I met Jim Bateman, who we discovered his grandfather John had known mine, and they'd worked together. On Jim's sitting room wall, there was another photo. Here it is. From the same set which I hadn't seen before. There again was the raw youngster, this time in the middle of the front row, the only one not wearing a hat. When I showed Jim pictures of Stanley before and after his ranching days, different ones taken at home and afterwards, unprompted, he exclaimed, "That's your grandfather, no question." And I repeated the experiment 5 times with other ranching families who had connections with this area, and they all volunteered the same information. So I was convinced. For a researcher, it doesn't get much better than that. Amazing photos, amazing that I found them 127 years after they were taken. My grandfather says he deliberately appeared stupid so that his real self could hide behind a mask. He admits he was lazy, but he liked the camaraderie. Near me, he wrote, lived a former Parisian clown and a Russian count. I had come to a country where everyone was an exile. Now, I don't know if the Parisian clown or the Russian count is pictured in this shot, but one can imagine perhaps. Then there were Stanley's articles written for the Calgary Herald, written when he was still a cowboy. He sent reports of the district to the paper on a regular basis. In the winter of 1895, he wrote 2 farces for the locals to perform, and then promptly reviewed his own creation and performance for the paper. "Does your mother know you're out?" his report runs, was received with enthusiastic applause. This little piece, the author of which is Mr. Stanley James, went merrily from start to finish. Though Mr. James acted in the spirit of burlesque, it was no less satisfactory. Modesty was a trait that seldom troubled my grandfather. On one occasion in 1897, when he delivered his report to the paper in person, the editor gave him the job of deputy. Stanley, by now bored with ranch life, jumped at the chance. He was solely responsible for producing a special edition on the Klondike Gold Rush, which I found in the archives, and it's an impressive piece of journalism. But when he wrote an article attacking the unscrupulous recruitment agencies which lured miners from Great Britain on false pretenses, the editor sacked him. Penniless, he headed south to Lethbridge, where his brother Norman was now running a general store. He walked alongside the railway track, virtually non-stop, for more than 24 hours, too afraid to rest because of the rattlesnakes, he said. This is my photo taken in 2018, and it was incredibly moving to discover my grandfather's lonely route and follow in his footsteps. And the photo on the right is of 2 hobos from that time walking along the railway tracks. Stanley joined Norman before branching out on his own to sell tobacco and soap to navvies building the Crow's Nest Pass Railway. Then he became a navvy himself. The railway theme continued when he teamed up with a friend who was about to ride the rods as a hobo the 2,000 miles to Toronto. The journey took them 3 weeks, getting thrown off trains and freezing in the prairie nights. It was 1898, and the US-Spanish War was about to kick off. Needing money, and perhaps not thinking entirely straight, he volunteered for the American Army and was sent to Cuba and then Puerto Rico to fight the Spanish. What he wouldn't have told his army recruiters was that a Canadian paper had already hired him as a war reporter. They wouldn't have liked that, doing 2 jobs at once. One night in Puerto Rico, when on sentry duty, the soldier next to him fired at what he swore was the enemy advancing. Panic spread, and the platoon retreated, but no enemy gave chase. In the morning, a white cow was found riddled with bullets, mistaken in the dark for white uniformed Spaniards. However, when Stanley faced the real enemy, being desperate not to kill anyone, he aimed his bullets over the heads of the enemy intentionally missing them. That, surely, is the first sign of his pacifism. In the final days of the campaign, he became severely ill with what was dysentery or yellow fever. But he recovered in a New York military hospital, and with his payoff money, bought his passage back to England. He was 30 years old. The claustrophobic Wimbledon suburbs were a shock to our returning prodigal after the wide open vistas of the prairies. He found his father, Daniel, now minister at Christchurch, pictured here, dying, and he assumed the role of pastor without any qualifications, and perhaps too without any Christian faith. Father and son may have made up. I just don't know. The congregation warmed to the topics of Stanley's sermons, and he wrote, "The egotism of the pulpit was in my veins." Daniel died in 1900, and Stanley was appointed temporary minister. Then he met and fell in love with Jess, whose mother was friends with Stanley's mother, Clara. Had the two devised the meeting? I don't know, but it worked. The trouble was, the Healeys lived in Buckinghamshire, but here was a chance for another adventure. After his Sunday evening duties were over, my grandfather jumped on his bike and rode 40 miles through the night to her Chiltern village. Romance blossomed, and they became engaged. They made a handsome couple. But the time had come to get a proper job. Through Clara's connections, he became minister at the Congregational Church in Teignmouth, Devon. It was a good time, the lull before the storm. He set up discussion groups, a literary society, and took an active part in the community. He and Jess had 4 children in quick succession. And in 1906, he was offered the post of pastor of Trinity Church, Walthamstow, and accepted, attracted by the challenges of a fast-growing London suburb. Challenges? You bet there were. Over the next 10 years, my grandfather embraced virtually every progressive political, cultural, and religious movement going, earning himself a feature in the Christian Commonwealth newspaper. It stated, "The Reverend Stanley B. James has made a place for himself in Walthamstow, and a very distinct place it is. The bold words which he has preached have made him the centre of a somewhat fierce controversy." The Walthamstow Guardian reprinted the article on the 11th of December 1908, the day before my mother was born. Here are the children in about that time, 1909, probably 5 of them, and my mother is the youngest, sitting on the floor on the right-hand side. By now, Stanley had qualified as a congregational minister. I hope I'm not being disrespectful when I say, however, that this was more to do with securing a position of pastor than any heartfelt belief in the tenets of nonconformism. And here's some shots of Walthamstow from that time. The house in the middle is where they lived, 118 Grove Road. It's still there today. The pulpit on the right is where he preached his revolutionary sermons from, and it's still there today, still used today in the church. The church itself is bottom left, Trinity, Orford Road, Walthamstow. And the top left picture is the Baker's Arms in Hoe Street. And the family lived about 5 minutes walk from there. And it was when they moved in about 1906, it was coincided with the introduction of trams. You can see one there. So that must have been taken, that photo, which has been coloured over about the time they moved there. So what were these ideas he allied himself to? One R.J. Campbell invented the new theology and was pulling them in by the thousands at City Temple, Holborn. The new theology provided a heady mix of socialism and mysticism, and Stanley fell for it. But many in the congregation left. Then came his membership of the Labour Party. As a result, traditional worshippers deserted their pews, only for younger progressives to fill them. Next came suffragism, with a similar outcome: more out, more in. In 1914, of course, war loomed, and Stanley knew he was a pacifist by inclination. When he declared this latest belief in the pulpit, large numbers walked out, never to be replaced. I mean, there were many women in the congregation whose sons or husbands or both were fighting on the front in France. The church was in turmoil. Someone called my grandfather a rotter. Another referred to him as a dipper, meaning he dipped in and out of every trend going. Worse was to come. Enter three beautiful women: Eva Slawson from Leytonstone, Ruth Slate from Manor Park, and Minna Simmons from Walthamstow, all three part of the church's progressive arm. Their stories, told against a sinister backdrop of bomb-packed Zeppelins hanging above their East End rooftops, are contained in their diaries and the letters they wrote to each other, and in which Stanley played a large part. These amazing documents are open for reading in the Women's Library of the London School of Economics. So, first, Eva, beautiful Eva. She fell in love with Stanley, and he with her. She recorded her feelings of longing in painful detail. She wrote to Ruth, her friend, "I had a wondrous evening with Mr. James, one of those rare and beautiful experiences difficult to describe. I seemed to live in another world for some days afterwards. I spent the night in a state of ecstasy." Eva's relationship with my grandfather was, I think, to remain platonic, and tragically she died, aged 30, of undetected diabetes in March 1916. Enter Minna, by now a widow and mother of four, friend of Eva and Stanley. There is no photo of Minna, at least that I was able to find, but I do have some of her letters written to Ruth. And this particular one is actually central to my research. And amazingly, it is published in the Virago book of women's love letters in the early 1990s, sandwiched between a letter from Maud Gonne to W.B. Yeats, the poet, and Violet Trefusis to Vita Sackville West. So Minna, the nurse from Walthamstow, is in good company. On the 15th of July 1916, she wrote, just 4 months after Eva's death, to Ruth, "What I now confess is with the deepest shame and humiliation, yet with joy that one can feel as I have felt, is to know the very consciousness of reality. Stanley and I had a most lovely talk. We went into the front room alone, and he kissed me, opened my dress, and kissed my breast too, and he said how he felt I was his. He was just going away when he came back and pleaded with me to give him everything a woman can give a man. I told him I was sure we should regret it, but anything that would make me his. Well, dear, I did. The tears I've shed quite washed away any wrong I did. The strangest thing is that I haven't felt I wronged Mrs. James. No, I felt what love he gave to me was mine and never was hers. Yours, Minna." Enter Ruth. In the London School of Economics library, I've found 9 letters my grandfather wrote to Ruth. He is desperate for connection with her, the most intellectual of the 3. He offers condolences following Eva's death, then outrageously suggests that Eva's passing could be so that he and Ruth could be together. He turns Christian fellowship on its head by suggesting they become more intimate. Of all my grandfather's transgressions, this is perhaps the most embarrassing because of its deviousness. And here's the family now. There are 7 children. And my mother is the one with the bucket and spade on the left. They've all passed away now. By December 1916, Stanley's time was up. The deacons forced him to resign, his continuing pacifism proving to be the last straw. With a small band of his closest followers, he set up a new church at Burley Hall, Leytonstone, which sought to combine socialism with ritual, a sort of high church nonconformity, if you like. But it folded within months. But not before it linked up with the communist-leaning Brotherhood Church in Hackney, where the talks of anarchist Captain Jack White, a close personal friend who founded the Irish Citizens' Army, were creating revolutionary waves. Here's Captain White. Now without an income, the James family suffered poverty for the foreseeable future, as Stanley attached himself to different organizations. First, there was the No Conscription Fellowship, where he worked with a young Bertrand Russell, pictured here. He recalled how he would draw the philosopher into conversation by putting some quite foolish question in philosophy, which he would answer with perfect seriousness and courtesy, and at considerable length. I'm afraid, Stanley writes, our routine work suffered not a little. Then there was the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he attacked Quakers for being elitist and too gentle. He longed for meetings to be interrupted by a, quote, sweaty, mud-stained, and foul-mouthed soldier from the front. It would have been such a relief to have heard somebody swear with real feeling. It was here, though, that he met the proprietor of the Crusader, a pacifist journal that he started writing for. Later, as editor, he hired a glittering array of writers. The Red Vicar of Thaxted, Conrad Noel, pictured bottom left. Jerome K. Jerome, top left, the author, of course, of 3 Men in a Boat. Muriel Lester, top right, the revolutionary Christian who hosted Gandhi in 1931 when he came to England for the first time. And finally, bottom right, Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragist. All these wrote for him, and in the middle of this slide you can see the masthead of the Crusader, and just underneath it, edited by Stanley James, and that I think is 1920. But Stanley clashed with each and every one of his star writers on ideological grounds, and eventually they refused to write for him anymore. Whoever said that pacifism was a gentle business? Finally, there was Kingsway House, under the creative leadership of Dr. Orchard, who was trying to combine the best of Protestantism with the best of Catholicism. Orchard appointed Stanley as his deputy, and now he could give free rein to his growing regard for Catholicism, even though he failed to introduce Mass to the hardened East End dockers who attended the Kingsway mission. Stanley remarked ruefully, they preferred billiards to the Bible. The family, meanwhile, were living out a Spartan existence in Somerset, in this cottage pictured here under the Mendips, very near Wells, looking out over Glastonbury Tor, in fact. To make ends meet, they gathered mushrooms on the Mendips and dispatched them by train to West End restaurants. Consignments of fruit and veg made the trip more often than Stanley did. But Stanley was drawing closer to Catholicism. Finally, he succumbed, and on the 2nd of July 1923, he was received into the church at the Priory, Haverstock Hill. He talked of, quote, a new sense of liberty. How is one to speak at that moment when the ship rotting in the harbour through weary years flings out her sails to the wind and feels the pulsing water of the open sea beneath her? I am conscious that life is only just beginning. He was 53. In the end, he abandoned his digs near Tower Bridge and joined the family at their rundown 5-acre smallholding in Hampshire, where they were now living and were to be for the next 18 years. They were still desperately poor, and my grandmother, who had heart problems, always kept a bottle of brandy about her. My mother told me how every day they waited for the postman to see if he delivered a much-needed cheque from Stanley's freelance writing. Jess, my grandmother, was long-suffering and must have put up with an awful lot. In a cramped garden shed pictured here, full of tobacco smoke and using an old manual typewriter, Stanley established himself as one of the world's leading Catholic writers. I found hundreds of his articles in 23 publications worldwide. In most of them, he wrote as a columnist, indulging himself in the luxury of the first-person singular. The three main strengths he possessed, the dynamism of the social reformer, the scholar's deep understanding of the scriptures, and an overriding sense of the mystical and supernatural, gave his writing power and insight. He covered issues concerned with authority, the polarities of communism and fascism, tradition versus revolution, distributism and land reform, mysticism and contemporary literature. It really was a heady mix. Books came out on a regular basis too, 9 of them in all. His best known, his first autobiography, The Adventures of a Spiritual Tramp, being published in 1925. It earned him an invitation from the celebrated artist Dame Laura Knight to come to tea to meet her friend, the writer W.H. Davis. Both the men, of course, had been vagabonds, hobos in America running the trains, and W.H. Davis had lost a leg in a railway accident. Anyway, we can imagine that the two former vagabonds that evening compared notes. Stanley carried out a 3-month lecture tour to the States in 1927, and he went to Rome and Belgium in 1938 to research his new book on the Catholic Action Movement. He consolidated his friendship with G.K. Chesterton, pictured here. Stanley retained his radical thought of earlier years, but it was juxtaposed with new conservative views. He praised Mussolini for introducing a Christian society to Italy and pointed out the positive aspects of fascism for the individual because, he claimed, it prevented blasphemy, regulated family life, and prohibited houses of ill fame. He travelled a long way since 1919, when Lenin's picture hung from his office wall. His conversion to Rome had profound repercussions for the family. He tried to force everyone to follow him, but in the end, only Jess and the youngest child, my Uncle David, did so. One aunt told me his Catholicism tore the family apart. With he and Jess now based in Hertfordshire, at the age of 72 in 1941, He was asked by the editor of the Catholic Herald to become his deputy. He accepted, and he loved it. The full-time job back in Fleet Street meant he had to spend the week in London. So he found a bed in a Belsize Park doss house where he shared a room with two down-and-outs. No working from home in those days. Here's a selection of his articles written during these days for the Catholic Herald. He had a regular column each week, and there's a wide range of themes, as you can see here. But in 1945, with his services no longer required, he moved back to live with Jess in the pretty flint cottage they rented. There were even roses round the door, and you can see them in these pictures. But forget any idea that they might now live out their days in comfort. The house was more than a mile up a remote lane, without mains, electricity, or gas. Water had to be drawn from a well in the garden and then heated on a wood-burning stove, and the toilet was outside. Sometime in the late 1940s, he visited his cousin Daisy Greener in Newport, and for old times' sake, she drove him back up to Llangibby. But in April 1951, there was a family reunion, and I was taken there to Hertfordshire, where my mother told me Stanley blessed me. So these pictures, Stanley obviously on the right, late 1940s, and the cottage itself is bottom left, very near Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire. And the picture in the bottom row is the reunion in April 51, and the other picture is another gathering at that rather lovely but very Spartan house. In late summer 1951, Stanley fell ill, and in November he died from stomach cancer in St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. His obituary in the Times and notices in countless other religious journals spoke of his learning, his kindness, and his youthfulness, all of which was true. But these exclusively male writers just didn't know half of what had gone on. For me, he remains an enigma, a man caught between heaven and earth. I've only been able to scrape the surface in this little talk. So if you'd like to know the full story, you'll just have to buy the book. And this last slide shows some details of how you can get hold of it. At the moment, it's best available on Amazon. So the last line of this form is the one to get the information from. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to my grandfather's rather extraordinary life. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Thank you very much.